All right, we've got Matthew Spandler-Davison with us
That's
today.
me.
It's good to have you here, mate. You've got a pretty, we've just been chatting before we got here, you've got a pretty long list of things that you're involved in at the moment. Let me just list them, and
Okay.
I'm going to pick your brains about how the different parts fit together, how they came about.
Yep.
A bit about your background. So you're the planter and pastor of Redeemer Fellowship in Bardstown, in Kentucky,
That's right.
which is in the US.
Which is in the US.
But you don't sound like a
Right.
American.
So I'm not.
You're from?
So grew up in Scotland,
Yep.
Aberdeen, Scotland. Born in Norway. Grew up in Scotland. Irish father, English mother, and then I married a girl from Alabama. So we met when we were 19. She was on a mission trip to Scotland. I became a Christian when I was 18.
Through her?
No, through a small little Baptist church of about 15 people. That's where I heard the gospel. The pastor of that church was an American doing his PhD at Aberdeen from Alabama, which is the connection. So a group from the college where he was at came over, and that's how I met my wife.
Nice.
So yeah, then after I graduated uni, worked a little bit, and then felt called in ministry. And that's what led me to Kentucky to go to Southern Seminary.
Was that your American accent then you were doing it?
I don't know.
I've got a little bit of hybrid.
I've got
there.
multiple accents that kind of come out.
Yep. So you went to Kentucky, you studied there at seminary, and then you planted a church, Redeemer Fellowship in Bardstown. But that's not all you're involved in at the moment. You're also the executive director of 20 Schemes with Mez McConnell.
Yep.
And you're the operations manager of Church in Hard Places.
Yep.
Can you just describe what those two things are?
So when I moved to America, my heart was always to plant a church in Scotland. So that was my ambition. Was what led me into ministry. Was recognizing, like Aberdeen, where I grew up, there's very little gospel work happening. And so after planting the church in Kentucky, looking for a way for our church to be a church planting church back in the UK. So about 7 years ago, met Mez McConnell, who is a pastor in a church called Niddrie Community Church in Edinburgh, Scotland. Niddrie is what's called a scheme. Talk about what a scheme is. Scheme is really an area of concentrated poverty. It's an area of social housing. So I think in Australia, the closest equivalent would be housing commission, but it's often much larger in terms of population. It's got multiple generations live there. It's not as transient. It's quite a fixed community. Would be a housing scheme. So there's Mez. He's pastoring this church in the middle of a scheme, and I'm hearing of conversion growth happening there. I'm hearing stories of the Lord doing quite a unique work in that church. So my church was looking to just get alongside him to support the work there, and Mez shared that he would love to see churches planted across the schemes throughout Scotland. And so we just started talking, and then the fruit of that was our two churches forming a partnership that became 20 Schemes, which is a church planting ministry, church planting and church revitalization within the schemes right across Scotland. So goal being to plant 20 churches, so hence the name 20 Schemes.
Nice.
Mez was speaking at certain events around the world, and so 20 Schemes itself was beginning to get a level of influence that we weren't necessarily aiming for, but God was giving us, for whatever reason, influence to be able to speak into how to do church planting well in areas of poverty. A lot of guys who are doing, from our theological background, so Reformed, clear understanding of the gospel, understanding the church, inerrantist, we really don't do well ministry to the poor. We've kind of abandoned areas of poverty to heretics and hyper-charismatics and social justice movement, and we've just really not figured out how to do church planting well in poor communities. And so here's this ministry that comes up that is doing it, but is doing it from a certain theological perspective that enables us to be able to speak into other denominations and organizations that want to learn from us. 20 Schemes, though, is specifically for Scotland, so we wanted to have that conversation without affecting our core mission. And so Acts 29 is a church planting ministry that's global. Both Mez and I are Acts 29 church planters, pastors, and so Steve Timmis, Acts 29, invited us to come and basically run Church in Our Places as a ministry of Acts 29 that is equipping, training, and providing resources to church planters and churches that want to plant churches in poor communities.
Yeah, you're right.
And so that's what we're doing. So there's this connection in terms of it's the same thing, but it's different in terms of separate organizations.
Yep. How many countries are you partnering with, or areas are you partnering with Church in Hard Places?
So we run a apprenticeship program, particularly for church planters who are from a poor community that perhaps don't have access to formal theological training. Obviously, they can't afford it, or even if they did have access, maybe they wouldn't be able to get into formal training. Or a person who maybe has formal training but hasn't perhaps had contextualized training for church planting in a poor community. So that's our apprenticeship, 2-year apprenticeship. We have regional cohorts in just about every region. So we've got, last month I was in Nairobi for our East Africa cohort. We've got 18 guys there, the guys in Southern Africa, got a few guys here in Australia, New Zealand, Philippines. So there's probably, our goal is to have 100 apprentices globally in 12 networks, 12 cohorts in different regions around the world.
Yep. So it's quite, if you're at Bible college and you think about what to do next, if you think about planning a church, even, which is in itself hard, like you've done it, the natural inclination is not to go somewhere even harder, to make the hard job harder. So a lot of the time it is the middle class or the more affluent which will draw people to it. What is, as you're talking to people about planting and particularly reaching people who are lower socioeconomic, struggling in life, those areas, how is it that the gospel speaks into the conversation? You're talking to people about that?
One thing comes back down to motivation. What's motivating you to plant a church? What's motivating you to go to a certain community? And if there is a part of your city or a demographic within your city that is just currently being unengaged by any kind of clear gospel witness, then that should in itself motivate us to think about how can we plant a church, how can we raise up leaders, disciple, evangelize within a poor community. And so I think it's true, most places around the world, if you look at most cities where churches are being planted, where are those churches being planted? They tend to be planted in more affluent parts of the city, or the parts of the cities where there's a larger student population or an international student population, or kind of the wealthier suburbs of the city. The parts of the city where you don't see church ministry, you may see charity happening, or you may see mercy ministry happening, but you don't necessarily see healthy gospel preaching churches established in the areas of your city where life is just hard. And so that looks different if you're in slums of Nairobi as it does if you're in Brisbane. But there are parts of your city where life is just hard. It's harder to get a job. It's harder to get decent housing. It's harder to raise your kids. It's often you're struggling with mental health issues or abuse or addictions. And there's typically a part of our city where that is just stronger, or part of the region. And so what does it look like then to raise up a church plant team intentionally to move into that community with a desire to evangelize, to be good neighbors, to make friends, and then to disciple new converts to become a church in that community that looks like, sounds like, feels like the culture of that community.
So what are the particular challenges you see when teams head in there and start planting?
There's many challenges. So ministry in a hard place tends to be quite messy, so it's emotionally, physically exhausting, it can be quite discouraging. So if you think about discipleship in an area where most people you're discipling have real crises that they're faced with, whether that is overcoming a real addiction or coming out of an abusive relationship or a financial crisis, then you can only really deal with so many of those kind of relationships. I mean, those are all-consuming relationships, and so that in itself can become exhausting, draining, emotionally, spiritually exhausting. So the main thing for us, you have to have a solid team. You need to be full-time. But you can't do this work bivocationally because that removes you from the very community you're trying to reach. So you've got to be a full-time.
Which is pricey. That's expensive.
Yeah, and so I think that's where the rub is that ministry to the poor is often more expensive than ministry to the more affluent communities, because ministry to the poor is more labor-intensive, and if we're just going to be kind of crass about it, there's no return on your investment. It's just not like 10 years from now you're going to see a church that's vibrant and financially self-sustaining. The reality is that it's always going to need external partners that are going to support the work ongoing there. And I think the typical church planting model is we'll assess a guy, we'll send a guy, we'll support a guy for 3 years, and then you better prove that you're able to be on your own. That model only works in more affluent middle-class communities where, and so we set our church plants up to fail when they do ministry amongst the poor, if that's the starting point. for them.
So what do you do? How do you tweak expectations, training, long-term trajectory? What do you do?
So I think what part of it is to view church planters in poor communities as missionaries, and so we would never have that expectation of a missionary reaching unreached people. 3 years you're on your own. We'll pray for you. Good luck. And so see that there are parts of our cities that are unengaged, unreached, that we need to raise up, send out, and maintain a level of support for them while they're continuing to be faithful in the work on the ground there. So I think having the conversation's got to start at the partnership level. What does it look like to partner with a church that is doing ministry to the poor? What does it look like for us to send our people to move into parts of our city with the intent of actually being a missionary to that part of our city? Financially, what does it look like to provide support to them, but realizing that with money comes accountability, but not authority. I think a lot of time when we talk about church planting and supporting church planting, we assume that we're going to give you money, which means we then become an authority over you. And we just kind of assume that a church itself has viability and legitimacy, regardless whether it's economically, financially independent or autonomous. And so the authority there has to be the elders and the leaders of that church planting team.
Yeah.
And so, accountability, but that's separate from authority.
Yeah.
So those kind of conversations, I think that there's a lot of conversations that this globally that we just got to have about how we effectively supporting church planting teams to poor communities.
Yep, that's good. So can we dig into then that question of if a partner church is hoping to support a church in an area which is struggling and won't be able to sustain itself after 3 years, how is it that they helpfully do that so it doesn't become some sort of colonial act, paternalistic, patronising? How do you engage helpfully in that?
I think so recognizing that the need for a church is going to look different in a poor community and being comfortable with that. Not setting up your people to fail, but rather being an encouragement to the guys there. Seeing that there's a sense of value and worth to the ministry on the ground there, even though 5 years in there's still a handful of people that are really got a lot of struggles, a lot of problems. So just involving people in it can be very lonely, this kind of work as well. You can feel isolated, you can feel emotionally run down. So there's a lot of things, a lot of ways that church planting networks, organizations, denominations, churches that are partnering with church plant missionaries to the poor can really provide support, encouragement, whether it's providing respite, retreats, without a sense of you're just a little church at the end of the city, you don't really amount to much. But let's be a champion for the work that's happening there. Let's really celebrate the wins that are happening there. The win for us is the fact you're still there after 10 years. For talking about 20 schemes, ask the question, what does it look like? What does success look like in ministry and the scheme? So us is the fact that you are still there, that you haven't burnt out, pulled away, and left and abandoned a community, but there's still vibrant gospel work happening in that part of the city.
Yeah. It's a huge shift, isn't it? Just in your mentality. The people who go in there, at least, there's a security that has to be found, an identity has to be found in the gospel in order to say, I may not see fruit immediately. In fact, I may not see fruit in my lifetime, but I'll give my life to this.
Yeah, it takes a particular kind of skill set. So it's the way we assess our church planters, I think, has to look different when we're sending them to areas of poverty. What drives you? Are you relationally driven or are you activity driven? It's much more about relationship than rather than planning events or activities. Ministry looks different. What's motivating you? So if you're motivated by a love for the poor, then you're not going to make it. But if you're motivated by a love for the glory of Christ and that he be made known where he is not known, that we shine a light in a place of darkness in our cities, then you're going to stay there. And so it's just keep pushing into why are we here, why are we doing this? And I think those conversations and then recognizing you're part of a bigger team. I think it's why with 20 schemes we've got 6 church plant teams, but our guys really support each other, they encourage each other, they pray for each other regularly. And so I'm really struggling over here in my own little work, but my story is no different than their story. And so there's a commonality of our experience that just kind of reminds us that this is normal. This is what ministry to hard places looks like.
Absolutely. So we throughout Australia we've got about 25 million people. over 90% wouldn't be in a church on Sunday, and the percentage of people who wouldn't even be able to articulate the gospel is growing significantly year on year. For Genetic Push, who I work for, we're approaching 100 churches. We've helped plant with a local church, but we have not even scratched the surface. And part of the challenge is raising up people to send out, not just the planters themselves, but the people who go with them. Can you talk to us a little bit about how it is you do that in hard places, how you find the leaders to plant the next church? Because I'm sure you don't want to stop at 20. You get to 20, you think
so
100 more.
Our goal is that 20 becomes a catalyst for the next 20. And so, for us, sometimes there are already people there doing the work, and so there are often so a lot of our guys I'm thinking about who are working with us, they were already involved in a ministry to a poor community, but it wasn't a church planting ministry. So they may already live there, or they may already have done a ministry in a similar place, but it's been more of a parachurch or more of a mercy ministry, and then they saw the inadequacy of that, and so it's looking for what's already happening, and seeing are there communities where there are already there's gospel work happening, but it may be not church work, and is there a way that we can utilize the legitimacy, the contacts, the experience that those existing ministries have in this community, in this neighborhood, to see a church develop from it. And so we'd much rather identify what's already happening and see there's a way that can become or give birth to a local church in that community.
Now, the structures that we have often are set up for just like it's easy to go to a middle class place and plant a church. The structures we have are set up that are geared towards preparing people for that. For middle class planting, affluent planting, people with university degrees doing another university degree to before they do anything. But that doesn't work in hard places. So how do we indigenously train people over time for it? What do you think we need to change?
Yeah, so you think of all the systems we currently have in place, and there are some denominations, even the way the system towards getting ordained, it excludes many people who may be biblically qualified to serve as elders and church leaders, but they'll never make it because of the systems that were built and that were put in place. So we're just going to have, I think, a real conversation about theological training and ordination processes and how we're developing leaders. So here's one thing. The people who grow up in an area of poverty, they tend to learn differently. So just because someone's poor and then maybe they don't have a formal credential doesn't mean they're stupid. Often they're actually quite gifted, quite brilliant, and quite capable of learning. But they just learn differently. And so in Australia, you got the whole tradie system where you got guys who learn a trade, and it's often through an apprenticeship. And so they learn through seeing rather than simply reading and watching a lecture from a perceived expert give you some sense of knowledge. I think looking at ways that we can provide in-house, in-church development of leaders, whether it's through, without dumbing down the theology. I think, so we don't want to dumb down theology, we still want to be robust, but it's the way that we deliver that and the way that we train it and the way we assess it in people, I think, looks different for people who grew up in a different culture or a different context. So I think that's saying one thing. The other thing is look for unlikely leaders. So do we have in our mindset that this is what a pastor should look like? They should come from grew up in a certain kind of church, have a certain kind of even their vocabulary, the way they look, the way they dress, who they know, and who knows them, so the sense of credential. So are we looking for a certain kind of ministry? Mes McConnell says that in more middle class communities, typically you're used to the cream rising to the top. And so institutions like this kind of exist for those who kind of rise to the top of a church and say, I'll go to Bible college and become...
They'll be really pleased to hear you say that.
So
very pleased.
This is the cream of the crop right here. But in poor ministries, it's like digging for gold in the dirt. We've got to be prepared to get messy. We've got to be prepared to take risks on people. We've got to be prepared to change the way we do things in order to find those nuggets of gold, guys who are pure gold in their ability to preach and teach and be evangelists in our poor communities.
That's good. I like that image. That's good. So you have been working with a couple of Australian guys. So Andrew Beddoe, Bruce Bennett as well. These guys have created for Australian context, vocational Bible
Absolutely.
training. So you've used that as well.
Yeah, so Andrew's doing Vocational Bible College is really looking at that apprenticeship model, and it's the same. It's robust in its terms of teaching of Old Testament, New Testament, biblical theology. It's not changing the content, but it's changing the form of assessment, and it's delivering it in the vocational school model.
Yeah.
And so it's still a formal qualification at the end. I think that's important as well. Some of the guys that we're training, they never dreamed they would ever get a degree.
Yeah.
And so they're able to say, look, the training you're receiving is just as legitimate in the guy who graduated from this college over here. And it's equal in terms of its validity. It's not like you're a second-class pastor or church planner.
Yeah.
And so I think having a degree of legitimacy, of being accredited like VBC is here in Australia. So we've used something similar in the work we do in Scotland, starting a Bible college specifically for training Indigenous leaders, kind of our access point into that. So there needs to be a different on-ramp into theological training, as opposed to, you've got a certain kind of training in terms of formal education, and then it becomes your on-ramp. There needs to be another form of assessment of a person's aptitude. And so it's the way we assess and train. I think, what Andrew's doing here is a good model. I think seeing that reproduced in churches and church planting networks is really helpful.
Are you seeing the next generation of leaders begin to emerge out of 20 schemes?
Yeah, I think so. So we have 20 guys who and girls. So we train full-time women's missionaries as well. That's really important that every church plant team has at least one full-time women's missionary, because most of the women in a scheme context or a poor community tend to be single, or perhaps have had coming out of abusive relationship, or themselves have vulnerabilities or issues that need to be dealt with by a godly, faithful, mature woman that is available to them. And so we train men and women for ministry, and still complementary and solidly complementary in the life of a church plant team. When Indigenous, when we say Indigenous, when somebody comes from that culture, comes to faith, and they show some degree of aptitude, we want to very quickly train them. Again, in poor community, often people have time, and so providing a structure and a sense of discipline and accountability can actually be really good for their own discipleship and their own development, and often their own growth as a Christian. And so plugging people in very quickly into a full-time internship program or apprenticeship scheme where they're being trained for ministry. And then at the end of it, they may go into employment and outside of church life, but we may be equipping them then to gain godly character, to be a faithful employee where they never dreamed of getting a job. Or they may go into full-time vocational ministry.
Yep. So what is this discipleship? It's obviously the heart and soul of every church, no matter where they are.
Yeah.
How does it differ in hard places?
So typically the model for a lot of churches, in terms of when they say the word discipleship, they have in mind a classroom setting, that you come to these discipleship classes where we'll teach you Christian living and understand the Bible, whatever. And so it's usually a small group Bible study, and that's what we mean by discipleship. That often doesn't work in a context and in a community where people are just living in chaos, living in crises, have real issues and vulnerabilities they need to deal with. And so the way we describe it is middle-class, affluent communities tend to do discipleship face-to-face. Experts standing in front of people, they take notes, they read books, they discuss it, they interact with it. It's more face-to-face discipleship. In a poorer context, it's more side-by-side. And it's much more one-to-one rather than small group. And so I'm meeting with this person one-to-one and reading the Bible out loud to them. We're applying the truths that we see it to real struggles and issues that they're dealing with, helping them think biblically about what they're hearing from their social worker, what they're hearing from their caseworker, what they're hearing from their doctor, giving them a biblical worldview. And so it's much more focused, individualized, one-to-one discipleship.
So why do you think it's one-to-one in groups? Is there a reason behind that?
Yeah, I think the nature of some of the real issues that people are struggling with.
Yeah.
I think the nature of people's lives unstructured in like nice, neat structures. Let's meet at 9 o'clock for a Bible study. And so us being able to adapt to the more chaotic structure and schedule that people may keep, I think it's just unrealistic to think that everybody's going to show up at a certain time every week to sit through a study and sit through it. Again, they learn differently. They learn more through seeing as well. And so inviting people to come and sit at your dinner table with you and just observe how a Christian lives, how a Christian behaves.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, much more involved, much more intensive. It's really intensive discipleship.
Yep, nice. All right, give us your dream. What's your hope 10 years' time from now for 20 schemes and for church in hard places as well? Like not just Scotland, which, we hope that goes gangbusters, but still, what's your dream? What do you have to see?
It wouldn't be great. So in Scotland, if we were to see 20 healthy, vibrant, growing churches in the schemes of Scotland that are seeing conversion growth and are being led by Indigenous leaders. A guy who today is a heroin addict, 10 years from now, who's preaching and pastoring his church in Aberdeen or in Inverness. And those churches then having a heart for planting churches. And I think what you'll see is Scotland then, you can't ignore that. You can't ignore the work of God, the movement of God happening when in most unlikely places the schemes are seeing an awakening of sorts. Then all of a sudden then the solicitors and the police officers and the doctors and the teachers, they're going to see that. And I think you'll see, actually, it's a lot of people think of the trickle-down effect. You plant in the parts of the cities where there's the establishment, and you plant there, and then it'll trickle down to poor. It never happens. No. There's so many cultural divides that it never gets to the poor. And so I think the opposite is true. I think it's what you see in the New Testament.
Absolutely.
That you go to the least of these, and then those who are in positions of authority and power will take notice and see, and they'll be provoked to ask the question, who is this God that is... as governments have been pouring millions of dollars into these communities and not seeing the kind of turnaround that this church is seeing in these people's lives. And I think that can be reproduced from Scotland to favelas in Rio de Janeiro to poor parts of Brisbane and Indigenous communities. And I think that's what we want to see, is those churches that are healthy, grounded in the gospel, training up leaders that become a light so that others may see clearly the glory of God on display.
It's exactly what we see in the New Testament as well.
Yeah,
Old New Testament, early church, bottom up. We need hundreds more humble and hungry and gospel-centered leaders. We were having a chat before, and one of the things that I've read is that in Australia, lower socioeconomic in Australia, of the top 20, 9 are in Queensland, and most are in Aboriginal communities.
Right.
And they're smaller and it's remote. Any insights into places you've worked about doing church in hard places and reaching those areas that are so remote, like Australia? It's just so vast and so different. Any insights into how we could think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so recognizing it's going to be hard, there's going to be a sense of isolation, but there has to be, and it's just missiology 101, you need a cultural outsider to go in to a culture, but not to change the culture. But to respect that culture, to learn from that culture, to learn the language of that culture, and then to bring the light of the gospel to people living in that culture. And it's a long-term view, it's a long-term ministry, and it's about making friends, being a good neighbor, to demonstrate a gift of hospitality in your home, and then having opportunities to speak the words of the gospel into people's lives. But for that to happen, there needs to be a groundswell of people willing to support and to be a resource so that they stay on the ground long term. I think that's the part that's got to happen first.
So conviction of people to go to the hard place and plant, and the conviction of those that God has gifted with resources to support them going.
I mean, there's a role to play, and affluent, rich churches have a obvious, clear role to play in supporting and sustaining gospel work in poor community. But it's not from a position of paternalism. It's from a position of partnership.
Absolutely.
And it's having the attitude as these are our partners. And so we want to embrace them, we want to support them, we want to respond to them as they raise needs and struggles they have. And we want to encourage them to stay there.